This podcast is on data collection methods in social science research. At this point, we're examining primary versus secondary data collection methods. Primary data collection is where you've created the survey yourself and you're administering it yourself. That's called primary data collection. A secondary data collection is data that someone else has collected. So, for example, this could be a survey that someone else has conducted that you're using for your research. One virtue of this is that the survey research outfit has already collected the data. So it is quicker in terms of availability, of course, but only if it is available. Sometimes survey data are restricted from your use. So you have to be kind of careful when you do your research design to make sure that you can gather the data that you need, and if it's secondary data, that you have access to the survey questions that you need in order to test your hypotheses. Here are ways to collect data. You can use surveys, you can do lab experiments, you can do field experiments, you can do natural experiments, you can do case studies, you can do interviews and focus groups, you can do ethnographic research and participant observation, and you can use what's called a mixed methods approach. So we'll spend our time on data collection in these several different ways. If we went the survey route, we would construct what is known as a questionnaire of what are called closed-end questions and open-ended questions. A closed-ended question has a set number of responses. An open-ended question allows the respondent to say whatever they wish to say. And in a survey, we ask a large number of randomly selected people to participate in it. Why would we use a survey? Well, we try to gather information from a representative sample of individuals to make a conclusion about an entire population of individuals. So it's at the individual level, and we'd like this survey, the sample of the survey, to represent a larger population. An example of a survey would be an election poll. And election polling is already taking place in the U.S. for the 2024 presidential election. A real pro of this approach is that you can make inferences and conclusions about a larger group of people based on your smaller sample. That is, it has strong external validity. Now, what are some disadvantages or cons? Well, it's often difficult to find a representative sample. People are resisting these days answering surveys. They're almost nearly impossible to reach via the phone because people don't answer their phones, and so surveyors have to use alternative methods to try to find a large enough sample. You need approval for your survey, so you have to go through an IRB, or Institutional Review Board, process. It's a time-consuming process as well, and surveys can be expensive. Also, we have what is called weak internal validity because we don't have very much detailed information about the participants. We don't have that rich description, in other words. Without detailed information about the participants, it's hard for us to be confident in our conclusions that we've found a causal relationship between the variables. It might be some other factor that we're not including in the survey. And of course, people also are deceptive when it comes to surveys. There are certain questions that they either refuse to answer or they answer in the way that the surveyor thinks, or they think that the surveyor would like them to answer it. So that's called social desirability. So people can also flat out lie on surveys. A definite drawback. So for surveys to be conducted, we need to go through what's called Institutional Review Board approval at the academic level. So the IRB makes sure that human subjects are protected. And that's the basic reason for the existence of the IRB. That the participants have the opportunity to opt out of a survey. In other words, they need to give their consent, and what's called informed consent, to participate in the survey. They can't be deceived into taking the survey. And as I said before, sometimes data are restricted or embargoed based upon the surveying unit. When you conduct a survey, adding to the expense, you want to do what's called a pilot study or test your questions prior to launching the whole survey itself to make sure that your questions are good ones and that respondents can understand them. And sometimes you have to find the funding to pay for respondents to be involved in the survey. Some survey units pay their respondents, especially those units that have respondents participate in wave after wave of surveys. All of that is expensive. An alternative way to collect data is to do what's called a laboratory or lab experiment. In a classroom-like setting, we have our subjects divided randomly into a control group and an experimental group, with the experimental group getting what's called a treatment or a variable. Then you measure the dependent variable after you've introduced this independent variable, this treatment. Why would we use experiments? Well, it's a way for us to control the independent variable. In surveys, we don't have the same kind of control. For instance, a survey could try to figure out what the impact of scandals is on voting behavior. We could have subjects read a prompt about a hypothetical candidate and ask them if they would vote for them. The control group would have just positive information about the candidate. The experimental group would receive a treatment or a discussion of a corruption scandal where the candidate was involved. The pros of this arrangement are strong internal validity. Since we have control over the lab environment, we can alter the independent variable and argue that changes in the independent variable lead to changes in the dependent variable. In other words, talking about corruption scandals for a candidate will probably have an impact on whether or not voters would wish to vote for that candidate. What are some drawbacks? Well, as with surveys, you need approval to conduct experiments. It's not always possible to find a random sample. And again, with surveys as well, they're time-consuming and they're expensive to conduct. You're asking people's time to participate in a lab experiment environment. You also have relatively weak external validity, in part because the experiment is kind of artificial. It's an artificial world. It doesn't have all of the environmental influences or impacts that would go with one's potential voting behavior. Also, subjects probably behave differently in an artificial experimental setting, classroom, as opposed to the real world. They could also engage in what is called the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect was named for an area in the United States where there was a factory, and factory managers noticed that the factory workers would behave differently when the managers were around as opposed to when they were not around. So when the managers were around, the workers would be more productive than when they were not around. That's called the Hawthorne effect. And that's again kind of a social desirability where the subjects wish to please the examiner, or in this case the experimenter, by trying to give the quote-unquote correct response to questions. So the Hawthorne effect will artificially influence our behavior, and thus conclusions that we make from experiments can be subjected to the Hawthorne effect. So with the lab experiments, you want to do the same things. You want to go through your IRB, informed consent. You do not wish to harm subjects. Some experiments from the 1960s, such as the famous prison experiments from Stanford University, had a profoundly negative impact on those who went through the experiment, because there was no real institutional control over the questionnaire or the run of show of the experiment itself. It went out of control. You do not want to do harm to human subjects, and sometimes data are again restricted in an experimental environment, depending upon the experimental unit that is conducting the experiment. We'd want to test the experiment, kind of a pilot study, prior to launching the full experiment itself. And sometimes we need to find funding to pay our subjects that are participating. Another type of experiment is called a field experiment. In a natural setting, subjects are divided into a control group and an experimental group. In this natural setting, the experimental group gets a treatment, and then you measure the dependent variable. So what's different is that this is not an artificial setting, but it's more in the natural environment. So if we want control over the independent variable, you'd have a more natural setting where people feel more normal in terms of their behavior, then we would do this natural experiment. So for instance, we could study the impact of social characteristics on the hiring process. In the experiment, we would have two groups of reviewers of resumes. One group reads the resumes of individuals with English origin names. One group reads resumes of individuals with Spanish origin names, so John versus Juan. And then we'd see whether or not there was some sort of implicit bias in terms of evaluating the candidates for hire based upon their last name. So a pro is that it has very strong internal validity. Again, we have control over the environment, even in this natural setting. And we can argue that there is a direct impact between the treatment independent variable and the dependent variable because we've ruled out other factors. I should add as well that in the experimental setting, there's a random assignment of people to the control group and the treatment group, the experimental group. That random assignment thus makes for a very powerful research design. It allows us to say that all other extraneous factors are controlled for because of this random assignment. One of the cons, big con of a field experiment, is that we need to find an appropriate natural environment. And not all natural environments will be welcoming for experimental research. So you have to get permission of the field itself, in other words, whoever controls the environment, to conduct the experiment. You need approval. It's time-consuming and expensive, just like with the other collection designs that we've looked at so far. So the experiment only somewhat matches real-world conditions. It doesn't completely match them, so the Hawthorne effect is present. It's just perhaps a weaker present. So it's a somewhat weak external validity situation. Again, you need approval for the IRB, the consent, informed consent, agree not to harm human subjects. Data might be restricted depending upon the organization conducting the field experiment, and you need to find funding in order to pay the subjects. Okay, so a fully natural experiment where variables naturally change in the real world. And the independent and the independent variable or treatment is randomly assigned. So why would we use this? If we wanted real world data, we could do this. So for instance, an example of this would be a lottery to determine which residence hall community each student lives in during their first year. And we could compare GPAs after the first semester to see if there's an academic influence on residence hall placement. We're actually using real-world data here, so we have strong external validity, but we don't have as much control over the independent variable. So it's not always easy to measure these real-world data. It's hard to rule out alternative explanations, and it's hard to control for other potential confounding factors. So we don't know, for instance, what class the student happens to be. It's not mentioned in this particular experiment. That might have an impact on GPA. So another type of data collection is called the case study. There we analyze the impact of the independent variable and the dependent variable on a small number of cases. So we want to be able to assess the detailed impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable. So we're going to get really granular, down to some fine detail on the independent variable itself, information about it, not so much measurement, but information. So an example of a case study would be to examine government responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. We could examine if democracies adopted more strict or less strict mitigation measures than non-democracies did. So this would be a detailed account of how the key actors in a democracy collectively responded to COVID-19 and how the key actors in a non-democracy chose not to respond. And so we have access to government information, freedom of information. We can also collect some other type of data that would be indicative of these experts, and thus have detailed information about this whole COVID-19 adoption process. So a real pro is that there is strong internal validity. We can use these detailed pieces of information about how the independent variable affects the dependent variable in each case that we study. There's very weak external validity, though. We can't generalize beyond the cases that we looked at. It's really easy to find easy cases, cherry-pick cases that fit your narrative and exclude cases that do not. So for interviews, we ask participants one-on-one questions. The interviews can go on for some time. They can be structured, or we can request specific responses to questions, or they can be unstructured, or we just simply throw out a question to a respondent, and the respondent answers in whatever way they wish. So we want detailed information from participants when we do interviews, and we get that detailed information. We could ask about some tough topics as well, questions about racism and sexism. And we also take out as an influence the external environment, because these interviews often are conducted in a one-on-one fashion. So the participants may be more candid in that circumstance. Focus groups are slightly different. These, definition of more than one person. So we ask participants in a group some detailed questions. Participants interact with each other. Again, that's different from interviews. And they're usually unstructured, allow the focus group members to participate in detail. So we want detailed information from participants. We're looking at them closely, and we want to see how participants interact with each other and how that affects the results. So we could ask participants questions about racism and sexism as well. We could assess how participants answer the questions when individuals from different socioeconomic groups are in the room. I should add as well, not on the slide, focus groups are often used in election campaigns to try to figure out what type of message may resonate with voters and which messages may not resonate so well. So the pros here are that we have strong internal validity, but we also have weak external validity. So we have some of the same problems with interviews and focus groups that we've had with other type of data collections. So with interviews and focus groups, again, we'll want to get the approvals that we've already talked about. We certainly want to test our questions before we do an interview or a focus group. We don't want to waste money or time. And we want to be able to have funding for the respondents to participate in these interviews and focus groups. Ethnographic research and participant observation is another type of data collection. In this, the researcher directly participates in the lives of the community that they're examining. So there are informants within the community that answer questions in detail, but the researcher is also participating in the active life of the community. It's a great way to get a first-hand account of how the independent variable affects the dependent variable. We could, with this ethnographic type of research, analyze how and why child migrants travel from one country to another. So this would involve the researcher inserting themselves into the migratory process itself. There's definitely strong internal validity. We get a detailed account of how independent variables affect the dependent variable in real time. A real drawback is that it's expensive to do these interviews. We have to find these people. That's a cost in terms of money and time. We need some cultural understanding, perhaps, especially if we are studying environments outside of the United States. We could have implicit bias that would affect how we view the informant's actions. And again, there might be weaker external validity because this is a special type of case and it may not be applied to other cases. So with ethnographic research and participant observation, we need all of these approvals that are listed: IRB, informed consent, restricted data, and do not harm. The next podcast will go into what is called mixed methods and data collection in social science research.